Hi, today we're going to talk about risk mitigation. This is a formula and a process that I've used for many, many years. I didn't invent it. It came from the India National Labs, but I've adapted it, as others have, to the educational environment, specifically universities and colleges in this particular case. I was a university police chief for many years. I've worked with thousands of schools across the country in the years that followed, helping mitigate risks and understand the risk profiles of the institutions. And this is a formula that I've used over and over again. It's simple, easy to use, and if you haven't seen it, we're going to teach you how to use it today. So the concept is that risk is made of three components: consequence, vulnerability, and probability. Pretty simple when you look at what that means. Consequence, what's the consequence to the institution if the risk happened? Now, some of these risks may be department specific, i.e. university or college police or public safety department. Some may be institution-wide. Larger universities may have a separate emergency management department that mitigates these risks separately. Smaller universities may do it through the public safety department. You may want to use this just for public safety related risks or for larger. It really is malleable to what you need. You can do it yourself with your leadership team or a larger group and committee. But again, the formula, risk equals consequence times vulnerability times probability. So consequence, what's the consequence if this risk happened on campus? What would be the impact? What would happen? What would that look like? Vulnerability, how vulnerable is the campus, the department, whatever you're looking at around vulnerability to this particular risk? Again, these are on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being lowest, 5 being the highest. You could do a scale of 1 to 3. I don't think it gives you enough nuance. If you go 1 to 10, way too much nuance in conversation. 1 to 5 seems to work pretty well, but again, you can play with that to make it work for you. And then probability, what's the likelihood, the probability that this risk will happen on your campus or to your institution or to your department? And so you look at these three components of risk. So the first thing to do is kind of brainstorm a list of risks. And I've got some here that I've already scored. For the sake of the exercise, I'm going to add one here that's going to mimic one of the ones there for good reason here in a second. Let's use the risk of targeted violence. So targeted violence typically is the active shooter or the mass casualty. I think there are nuances to targeted violence, but for the sake of this conversation, let's think about the larger targeted violence, mass casualty type tragedy. So the first question is, what are the consequences for this exercise to the department? You could break it there, to the institution, to the college, if this kind of a tragedy happened. And my guess is on a scale of 1 to 5, it'd be a 5. From those I've spoken to, colleagues that have had the unfortunate experience of having to have dealt or lived through this kind of an event, big consequence in a number of different ways. So we're going to put a 5 here. Right? How vulnerable is the campus to this kind of an event? My experience is that universities and colleges in particular, whether it's a 2-year, a 4-year, a graduate, a professional school, have open campuses. They, for the most part, the boundaries between the campus and the community are nebulous and don't exist in terms of gates and controlled access and the like. So vulnerability of something happened, not just from an outsider, but from someone, a part of the affiliated to the institution, pretty high. I would imagine it's a 5 if we looked at what that would look like. So again, if we put 5 in here, and then probability, what's the likelihood that you'll have that kind of a targeted mass violence scenario, tragedy on your campus? Statistically speaking, it's pretty low. These are high impact, low probability events. So if we had to look at it just from that, probably a 1 for the sake of this exercise. So I'm going to put a 1 here. So if we use the math, then we know we've just assigned a risk score of 25 to this particular risk. Now, we've done that with just a handful of other risks that we brainstormed for this exercise. They all got a number assigned to them, and they are all mitigated. They're all dealt with a little differently, but you now have a scale, 1 to 125, right? 1 being if everything was a 1 to 125 if everything was a 5. You're now able to put these risks on that scale and understand where they may group, where you may have some vulnerabilities or issues, what you need to tackle first. Keep in mind, you're going to deal with all of them. We just don't always have all the resources we need to do them all at once. So there's got to be a reasonable way to prioritize them, and this provides that. So for example, weather, I was thinking here about weather because in Vermont we get snowstorms and ice storms. And on a scale of 1 to 125, it scored as a 25. Well, why is that? Well, the university's done a pretty good job at looking at these. The consequence of a snowstorm or an ice storm at the university, if it happened, could be significant, but the university's built in a snow climate. It understands, right? So let's say we give it a 5, just for the sake. How vulnerable is the institution to this? Low. University has residence halls, it has its own generator system, its own heat, its own food services, it's got plans for all of that. I assigned it how vulnerable the institution is to a snowstorm after 200 plus years of being in Vermont is probably a 1. But the probability that there'll be snow here, if we look at weather as snow, there may be sub-weather under that, a 5. So again, 5 times 1 times 5 is 25. Does it mean we don't have plans for snow? Of course we have plans for snow. But on a scale of risks to be mitigated, it ends up being lower on the priority list than some others. And you see we've gone through that. Now, targeted violence on this list, substance abuse, Title IX, sexual and gender violence, an issue on campuses across the country. Study abroad, self-harm, threats of violence on social media and digital conversations, significant problem because most of the violent acts we're seeing, self-harm and harm against others, is being foreshadowed or leaked on social media and digital platforms. And universities now need to pay attention to that to catch these issues before they manifest to get people help, right? So this is a high, this scores high on that, right? But if you look at targeted violence, it scored a 25, but we also know that we're not gonna not have plans to deal with this kind of an incident. So there's always a political lens and a practical lens that looks at the risks that you've mitigated to figure out what may need to move and how it needs to be dealt with. The point is, this process will give you a tool to be able to take a risk, assign a number to it, prioritize it, shuffle where you need to shuffle, and to begin to allocate resources and focus as needed. Now, there's a link in this presentation that'll bring you to a worksheet we've built that you can download and use as a tool to manage some of this. Of course, Social Sentinel is here to help with the mitigation of the risks around threats of violence on digital conversations. If there's anything else we can do for you, please reach out to us, our website, www.socialsentinel.com. Thank you and have a great school year.